Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone and welcome to another week of Cash Plays. Horse with Michael DeMichele, and it's the last week I will be here at the World Series of Poker. I played in the main event, I believe, on Sunday, and I'm recording this on Monday, and I was knocked out. Actually, I played on Saturday. Knocked out of the main event, and in terms of tournaments this year, it just could not have gone worse for me in vast comparison to last year, where I was really on a hot streak. I've been doing so well in the cash games, though. I wonder if my cash game play affected my tournament play, because I do remember last year that I hardly played any cash games. I played mostly one tables, and obviously, I had some great success. And I don't know necessarily, if I do come back next year, what approach I'll take, because I know a lot of people, when they come to the World Series, they tend to just stick with one discipline because of the possibility of, messing up one's tournament game or one's cash game. And unfortunately for me in the main event, I had a pretty big suck out where I got in with 3 7s against ace queen on a queen 6-7-7 board in the beginning of level 3 for about a 40K pot. And the guy hit a queen on the river, which knocked me down to 10, so I should have been right around 50 at level 3. But the same thing happened to me last year, actually, when I came out with a pretty big chip stack at the end of day 1. I got sucked out on, and I got knocked down to 5,000 in level 3. Then I ended up finishing 115th in that event. This year, and the hand that I went off on, I wonder if I played a little bit too recklessly again, like it was a cash game. I ended up playing for stacks with about 10,000 left, a couple minutes before the dinner break when the blinds were 150, 300 with no ante, and then we were going to come back with 150, 300 with a quarter ante. And one guy limped in mid-position, and I completed in the small blind with 7-6 suited, and the board came out 7-6-5 with 2 hearts. Ended up playing for stacks on that hand, put a big check raise in, and the guy shipped, and he just had ace-jack of hearts for a flush draw, and he made it. But again, I wonder if I felt, I had 10,000 in chips, which is still a lot. I mean, in comparison to some of those other tournaments with the 1,500 when you only start with 3, 10,000 in a dinner break, that would have been great. So I wonder if I should have just check called and waited for a safe card. I wonder if I put my tournament life at risk too many times during the main event. And again, this year it just wasn't meant to be for me, because I was really looking forward again to this deep stack structure, and I just couldn't really get anything going. Got that bad beat, and again, maybe played a little bit sloppy in the sense that I was taking some chances early on that I didn't really need to take. And I am done. I'm going to hang around here in Vegas probably for another week or so, try to get some more interviews for cash plays, and then it's back to LA. I just got a text from a buddy of mine saying the Rio is basically dead on day 1 of day 2 in terms of cash games. I might head over to the Bellagio and play a little bit. A lot of email response from last week's show. And before we get to that, I want to say that when I recorded the conversation with Michael DeMichele, it was last week, and it was immediately after the Durr conversation. So none of the stuff that had come out about all that final table antics and BS really had made its way out into the public. So I didn't ask him about it. Obviously, if he was on this week, I would have asked him about it. All that stuff about him taking an hour or taking a full minute and a half to raise Barry Green's sign, I think on 5th or 6th Street, of a round of Razz at the final table with the board lock with a 6 low, and then dancing around after he won the hand, which apparently we're going to see on ESPN. Again, just wasn't in the news, so didn't ask him. I would have asked him. So if you're looking for that, you're not going to get that. A lot of response from last week's show. A couple emails I want to get to. Again, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com. And a lot of negative emails. I probably got 9 or 10 negative emails with people who were unhappy about Durr. Here's just a couple of them. This one comes from Dion from Sarasota, Florida. He says, "Hey Bart, your show is awesome. However, the Durr episode made me realize how much I dislike this guy. He is over-the-top arrogant, talked down to you, called your questions dumb. Please spare me from ever having to listen to him again on your show." Here's another one. Phil from Philadelphia. "Wow, what a cocky hotshot Durr is. I thought maybe I misinterpreted his actions on the 2+2 poker cast, but after listening to him on your show, the guy is a real prick." Last email here. Jacob from Miami. I don't understand why Dirk continues to give interviews when he obviously has no respect for anything or anyone in poker media. His attitude is always one of cockiness and arrogance, and he is quickly becoming one of the most disliked young players in poker. Please have Oh My God Clay Aiken on your show. And that was just kind of a summary. Again, I got about 10 or 15 emails basically saying the same thing. Now, there was a thread that popped up on 2+2 this week about cash plays, which was kind of good because I could see there was a lot of people that liked the show, and I responded to some of the negative criticism that people gave to Durr, and I wouldn't hesitate to go out and say that, yeah, you know what, this kid, obviously he's cocky, he's arrogant, but I really don't think this is the case with Tom Dwan. I wrote up in the post, and again, ever since I did the first interview with him on Poker Road Radio, which I think was back in November at Foxwoods, he's always gone out of his way to come up and say hi to me. He's always very, very friendly, and that's a lot more than I can say about other people that have come through on Poker Road Radio and just other people on the industry. In fact, I was kind of, I don't know if you want to say shocked, or I was really surprised. He actually came up to me during the break of the 50,000 horse, where I saw him and we started talking, and he talked to me about a hand that he thought he misplayed in Omaha 8 or better. He then introduced me to Oh My God Clay Aiken, Phil, who was standing right next to him. So I think that Durr gets a bad rap. I think his attitude is somewhat laid back, and I think people interpret that as cocky. But after we finished the show, he stuck around and just talked to me. I didn't even ask. I thought he was going to run off because there was a big game going at the Rio. He just stuck around and chat. Really, I thought he was kind of a nice guy. So my personal opinion is, even though it might have sounded possibly like he was a little bit cocky or arrogant, I really just don't think that that's the case with him, and I think he gets a bad rap. And I would not be, I wouldn't hesitate to say that he was cocky if I thought so. But with him, in his case, it's just kind of a laid-back type vibe, and it just sometimes comes off in the wrong way. So I kind of have to disagree with all these negative emails coming in. I think the guy gets a bad rap. And again, he's probably one of the nicer guys I've met on the tour. So I just wanted to respond to all those emails. Going to get to a couple other emails here before we go to break, and before we do this conversation about horse with Michael DeMichele. And 3 or 4 emails have come in this week, and I'm going to read a couple of them. This one comes from a Jose Smith. 3 or 4 emails about this topic. Jose Smith says, in the last cash plays, you mentioned something that I've been a little miffed about. How does one go about finding a good table to play at? How would you define good online live, and how do you determine if a table meets those standards, especially if you're unfamiliar with any of the players? Ray from Philadelphia says, I was wondering what you're looking for when you're selecting a table live or online. Are you looking for larger stacks, which are sometimes filled with regulars, or are you looking for typical prototype fish by the way of looks? I also heard an interview on the 2+2 PokerCast with David Skolansky. He stated that you should be table hopping. Do you table hop, and what are the things that you look for when you decide to change tables? Now, again, I don't really play a ton online with No Limit, but if I'm table selecting online, it's kind of the same thing of when I'm doing table selecting live. I like to find games, if I'm playing in uncapped games, with deeper stacks. I don't really want to play against short stacks. Part of the reason, and a lot of times when you're dealing with people who are short stacking live, it's normally that they're not good. You don't find many short stacking experts live who are playing, optimal short stacking strategy. Now, I know you find more of that online, where you find some short stackers, but from some of the videos and stuff I've watched on Card Runners and Deuces Cracked, seems like a lot of the top instructors kind of feel the same way, that the short stackers usually aren't the best players anyways. So I usually like to find deeper stacks. Now, you might say, well, aren't those players stronger? Yes, but at the same time, I have my own confidence in my game, at least live, that I'm a lot better than a lot of those regulars that play, and I would rather be able to exploit a deeper stack than a shorter stack. When a shorter stack, a guy could play suboptimally, but again, it forces you to do certain things. You can't call raises against a short stack. I hate it when the short stacks limp in from early position, because a hand that you would normally raise, whereas now you can't really raise from out back because you can't really call a limp re-raise. and the guy's been doing that a lot. So for me personally, I like to find a deeper game. I like to find, deeper stacks. In terms of the looks, and that's basically all I can really talk about online because you can't really see anybody. In terms of the looks of the players, especially out here, honestly, I'm usually thinking that a table with older players is a better table. The aggression factor of younger players is just so much higher than, say, maybe even some good self-taught older players. Older players aren't going to be doing a lot of 3-betting pre-flop. They're not going to be putting a lot of pressure on you. I think whenever they put pressure on a hand, you can easily release. I played a hand against a guy in the 25-25 no limit game that I know from LA, where I raised it with aces and the board came out 6-5-3 rainbow, and he check raised me on the flop, and it was just an easy fold. His range is always better than one pair there. Whereas, a younger player might put you to the test with a draw, a pair and a draw. He could just be making a play knowing that you really can't call a big raise and then a couple big streets with just one pair in that spot. Older players tend really not to do that. So when I'm looking for table selection for a live game, I'm looking for bigger stacks and I'm looking live for older players. And I like a tight, weak game. A lot of people say, well, if you find these old guys, they're grinding and they don't give you any action. You know what, though? I really think that you can kind of use that mini-ish raise in position. And then if you get good with the board texture issues, you're betting and they're folding 70-80% of the time. You don't always have to win big pots to win big money. I like a weak, tight, older game. And that's really kind of what I look for table selection. So I hope that helps you out, Jose and Ray. Second email here. And this email goes on to say, I've heard Barry state that he always likes to raise the same, Barry Greenstein state that he always likes to raise the same exact amount pre-flop. I believe approximately 3 to 4 times the big blind is the proper pre-flop raising size according to him. This way, no information can be gained from the size of the raise. Now, I've heard you, Bart, say that you might raise pre-flop 6.5 to 7 times or even higher. I've noticed in 2-5 no limit and 5-10 no limit live cash games that a 3 to 4 times raise is likely to get 5 or more callers in live action, yet playing online a 3 times big blind raise will get fewer callers and likely a 3-bet from a better online player in a full ring game. Thank you for the email, Mark. And I have really changed my view on pre-flop raising size. When I used to do Live at the Bike and any other types of shows earlier on, I used to think that 3 to 4 times the big blind was too small for a cash game. In my bread and butter 5-10 no limit game at the Bike, I would open a 6, 5.5, 6, 7 times the raise size. But I've really changed my views on this. And I like keeping pots smaller pre-flop. I think that opening to pot size raises are the best way to raise. If you're going to open from the cutoff in a 10-20 game, I like usually 70 or 80. 5-10, now I'm usually raising to 35 or 40, where before I would raise to 60 or 65. It just keeps the pot size smaller before the flop comes out. And it doesn't matter because if you're making a steal from the cutoff with 6-7 of diamonds and you raised it up to 60, well, now the guy's range in the big blind is pretty well defined. Remember, you're not really trying to steal the blinds in no limit. So if he makes a call there and now all of a sudden the pot's 120 and you see a favorable board texture flop like a king 3-5 and you bet out and the guy calls or the guy check raises you, well, you've had to bet out 80 or 90 now into 120 or maybe 70 or 80. Whereas if you had say made it 35 and the guy called, well, now you really only have to bet 40 or 50. I think that you tend to start losing some money when you raise very big pre-flop and making bigger continuation bets when you really start to, polarize a guy's range, what he'll call with 2 cards out of position. And normally what he'll call with is a more premium hand with a 6 times blind, 6 or 7 times, pre-flop raise blind size, where it's difficult to take the pot down with a single continuation bet. The guy calls with, pocket 8s are up in the big blind. And now the board comes out king 3-5. Well, he's not necessarily just going to fold to your bet, But if you're raising it up to 35 or 40 and now he's going to call with like the Jack 8 suited, stuff like that, where he's just going to dump the hand, I think overall I'd rather be in that spot in position than just to be up against a bigger hand. Now, obviously, when you're stealing those pots, when you've raised it up more pre-flop, you're stealing a bigger pot. But I really have come over to, and if Barry Greenstein said this, kind of that school of thinking where 3 to 4 times the raise, the pre-flop big blind size, I think really is the way to go. Now, you add a couple of limpers in there, you're playing a 5-10 game, and 4 or 5 people have limped in front. Well, now all of a sudden a pot size raise is going to be up at 70 or 80, which is fine, because if you start raising to 30 now, well, now you're going to see, a pot 6 ways. And unless you're very, very skilled, I think a lot of players get lost with a big pocket pair in that spot. You raise up to 40 with 6 limpers from up front with aces. I think you do want to thin the field a little bit there. Wouldn't mind a bigger raise. But if you're opening, or even after a few limpers, I like that pot size raise. Now, you have to understand when you're 3-betting, and here's where I don't like the pot size raise. When you're playing deeper and you're 3-betting a guy out of the blind with a premium hand. Say you're playing with $4,000 or $5,000 effective stacks, and a guy makes it 70 in a 10-20 game, and you've got aces. Well, if you throw a pot size re-raise in there now, 70 plus 70, it's 210, and you're out of position, he can call you with any number of hands in position. But if you throw a pot and a half size bet or a double pot size bet, he makes it 70 and you make it maybe 250 or 300, it becomes very, very difficult for him to call with any type of hand that's not a pocket pair. Suited connector type hands. And a lot of times if you're 3-betting only premium hands, you're playing your hand face up. But for those of you that are comfortable only 3-betting premium hands out of the blind, I don't mind making it a little bit more and trying really to get a guy to, if a guy calls, you're winning in the long run. If you're starting with a $2,500 or $3,000 stack and he opens to 70 in a 10-20 game, and now you make it 280, 300, 350 with aces, any hand that he's going to call with there, he really doesn't have odds to call with. So even if he were to stack off, even if he were, say, to stack you off with 3-4 offsuit, you're winning in the long run. And I know it stings in the short term, but in the long term, it's just a spot where you're pricing him out. Now, in contrast to that, if you've got a big pocket pair and you're 3-betting in position, I don't mind a pot size raise or a smaller than pot size raise. The guy opens to 70 and a pot size raise is 210. Maybe you make it 190 in position. Position means so much when you're making that 3-bet raise size and trying to figure out how much you're raising, because I would much rather be last to act on subsequent betting rounds and actually maybe even keep a guy in there for value than 3-bet small enough out of position where he can call with almost his entire opening range because of our stack sizes. So I hope that helps you guys out. With that, we are going to take a little break, and we're going to have a horse discussion with Michael DeMichele right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays.
Scott Huff here from Two Jacks in the Hole.
And Joe Stapleton, also present and accounted for.
Joe, I have some bad news. I am leaving the USA.
That's actually very good news, Scott, because outside the U.S. is the only place you can play on Titan Poker.
Actually, I heard about that, Joe. PokerRoad.com and Titan Poker have teamed up to bring you an exclusive $10,000 package to the World Series of Poker.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty ridiculous package. You get 5 nights in Vegas, flights to and from whatever country you win it from, appear as a special guest on a Poker Road program, get picked up at the airport in a limo. That's my favorite part. But Scott, I know your favorite part is you get a coaching lesson from Joe Seabach, dinner with him and the Poker Road crew, and let's not forget the fact that you get a $1,500 buy-in to a bracelet event, No Limit Hold'em number 53.
It's easy to sign up. All you have to do is download and install Titan Poker. Use bonus code POKERROAD, one word, deposit at least $50 to your Titan Poker account, and then earn the most points between now and June 20th, and you get that $10,000 package to the World Series of Poker.
And remember, guys, this contest is only eligible for non-U.S. residents, so make sure you sign up with bonus code POKERROAD. You can't afford not to.
Cash Plays.
Welcome back, everyone, to Cash Plays Horse with Michael DeMichele. And it took me so long to finally pronounce that right, Michael. Thanks for coming on the show. This Cash Plays episode is obviously going to be playing before you are on ESPN for a horse, but you finished second place in the 50,000 horse, right?
I guess I did.
I'm not exactly sure when ESPN is going to put that on. Last year, they put it on after the main event. Obviously, I don't think they're going to do that. Well, the main event's in November, the final table, but they might do a schedule where they might put on all the preliminaries and then put on the horse afterwards. So just take a look out for that. But Chris, Death Donkey from Deuces Cracked, introduced me to you, and I'm a sucker in a good way for mixed games. There's so much talk about No Limit and now PLO that sometimes I think these limit mixed games are kind of put to the side. And you've been playing, you said, a lot live in LA. So take us through how you came up the ranks and with these limit mixed games.
Well, I started playing No Limit Hold'em when I first got my start. I was grinding 1-2 no limit, making like $13 an hour or something really small. And I went on to learn Limit Hold'em because I felt that it was the next avenue I needed to go to continue to make more money. And from there, I started to, as I moved to the East Coast, and I'm sorry, I grew up in the East Coast. When I started playing at Foxwoods, I noticed that there were some crazy games, mixed games, tables next to me with people who were just giving away money. And so I really wanted to learn those games, because it's not good to just be grinding in tough games all the time. It's nice to be able to play the best game in the house. So I really wanted to learn all the other games. And I guess I was just able to put my mind to it and really pick up all the necessary strategy to be able to succeed at them.
The beautiful thing, I've said it before on this show too, about Foxwoods, because I traveled there for Poker Road Radio, and this past spring for the WPT event I just went on my own, is they have those green chip mixed games. So it's not, when you're out in LA now where I live and play, the lowest mixed game they have is like 200, 400. But they've got the 50-100 over there at Foxwoods, right? 75-150, and some very juicy 150-300 games. Probably games that guys don't even have any business playing 20-40 in, right?
Right. That's the great thing about the East Coast, like Foxwoods. They have a lot of green chip mixed games. So I wasn't bankrolled to be playing 200, 400 and higher at that point. So I was able to play in less competitive games at smaller stakes, and that's really what allowed me to get the experience that I needed to get better at these games.
So I think what we're going to do here is we're actually going to go through horse and then go through a little bit of some of the triple draw games, which you find in LA in the mix, which is a Badoogie. Sure. And
they're in every mix out here too.
Yeah, and Deuce to 7 out on the West Coast. Apparently it's illegal in Connecticut or something to play the triple draw games. But right off the bat with horse, what I've found too, obviously Hold'em the first one, or if you're playing over in the East Coast, it's not necessarily always horse, but maybe an HOE type game, is that it seems like Hold'em is almost the most exploitable round if you're playing like an HOE mix against split pot players, and they seem to almost get a little bit scared of the H in that mix. How do you feel about that, or what's your experience with that?
Well, I think it makes sense that you would say that a split pot player might not be as good at Hold'em, because of course there are some fundamental concepts in both Omaha 8 or better and Stud 8 or better that are very, very similar. But I actually think that that Stud 8 or better plays a lot closer to Stud High and Razz. I think that it's much more comparable to those games because it's a stud structure, whereas right. Omaha 8 or better is a flop structure. And so while they are split pot games and there are similar skills, a lot of skills from Hold'em translate over to Omaha. So they all have their bridges. And not every rotation on the East Coast is HOE, but of course that does seem to be a decent amount of the rotations. I had a real disadvantage coming out here to the West Coast. I moved out to Vegas here a year ago, and I was living in LA for a temporary period of time, and I never had a chance to learn the draw games, of course, as you mentioned, on the East Coast, because as you said, it's actually illegal to spread them at Foxwoods and Borgata. Don't ask me why. It's some sort of gaming commission rule. So when I came out here and I started playing mixed games on the West Coast, I was constantly in rotations with triple draw and Badoogie in them, and I had no experience, and so I ended up playing No Limit Hold'em for a long time, and finally I was able to pick up on triple draw and Badoogie, and now I'm starting to feel like I'm just thinking on such a higher level with horse in general. Like I feel like all the things I'm learning from each specific game really translate into all the other games, and so everything really has its parallel in terms of learning curve.
Obviously, I mean, if you came up with Limit Hold'em, and most people know how to play Limit Hold'em, are there do you find when you're playing in a mix that usually has a split pot, like an HOE or even horse, that you do anything different in limit hold'em because maybe the limit rounds are softer than say a straight 100 200 limit game? I'm trying to figure out like where's the exploitability in that mix specifically with limit hold'em. As we address that first.
Of course, it all really depends on your opponents. I mean, sometimes you're in a game where everyone's weakest game is hold'em and everyone's best games are the split pot games, and sometimes it's vice versa. I mean, of course, it really all depends. And I believe in exploitable strategy and unexploitable strategy. And what I mean by that is when your opponents are playing a style that is just it's vulnerable and they're not they're not making correct plays in some aspects, you can come up with a counter strategy for that. And you see no limit players do it over and over again. They see their opponents make a mistake, so they do something to adjust to counter that. And that's just the same case with these games.
Yeah. Well, let's again, because everyone seems to play limit hold'em. It's kind of the one that I want to touch on the least. But moving over to Omaha 8 or better, I've talked a lot about 08 on the show, limit 08 and PL 08. Obviously, horse with a limit 08. Seems to me, a lot of it's almost like people play it the worst in a rotation. Like if you play straight Omaha like they have here 1-2, the players are somewhat decent, at least that they know what they're doing. Do you find that in that specific game that seems to be where the bread and butter is when in say like a 3-mix or a 4-mix type structured game?
Well, I think in this day and age, a lot of people are playing Omaha 8 or better really well. Mm-hmm. When I came from the East Coast, I did very well in a lot of the 8 or better games because it seemed that a lot of people were just starting to learn them, and I guess I just learned them faster than they did. But at this point, it seems that everyone's starting to get really competitive in the 8 or better games. But I definitely think it's a point worth making that it seems like it's very, very hard to play Omaha 8 or better as close to fundamentally correct as possible, whereas a lot of the other games seem much more easier to map out how to play them well. So, there's definitely a long learning curve to playing Omaha 8 or better as well as you can.
Well, we take emails on the show, of course, cashplays@pokerroad.com, and Will Sanders wrote in an interesting email specifically about 08, and he said, could you comment about the playability of non-ace low hands in 08? Can someone play like a smooth deuce 3-4-5, deuce 3-4-6 profitably, and from what position? I would imagine the value comes from 3/4 nut lows with a better straight, but how much heat can you stand pre-flop? And before you answer that, I'm kind of maybe the old school of thought that when I'm playing from up front, I don't usually like to come in with those hands. I like to have an ace. But from out back, like a hand like a 3 to a wheel, deuce 3-4. I mean, what do you think about like a deuce 3-4, maybe dangling card? Do you think that that's playable from out back?
Well, I think that that's of course, it's a very good question, mm-hmm. And I'd like to say that I think a lot of players have really mapped out exactly how you're supposed to play pre-flop and hold'em. It seems that everyone's playing the exact same cards and they're 3-betting the exact same hands. In Omaha, it's a lot more complicated, and I think that perfect pre-flop strategy is far from being constructed at this point. It's a lot closer in hold'em. So, when a guy plays from under the gun, you have to be really, really careful getting involved with hands like deuce 3 and hands like ace 4 and God forbid getting involved with ace 5. But when you start entering the steal positions, of course you can open raise deuce 3, and of course the other two cards that you have that go with it really, really do matter.
Right.
But in general, you have to be really, really cautious calling raises with deuce 3 type of hands when it's obvious that the opponent who's open raising has a hand that looks like ace deuce or ace 3. But of course, it's really important to assess the value of your hand against your opponent's range. So if your opponent opens in late position and you're looking down at deuce 3, this might be a great spot to 3-bet. If you think that he's opening up a range that's wide enough that deuce 3 plays well enough against it and you can actually chase a deuce 3 low after the flop, then go for it. But of course, when the guy opens under the gun and you cold call a raise with deuce 3 and you chase a low the entire way, the guy's going to show up with ace deuce or ace 3 every time, and you're going to end up you're chasing for half the pot you can't even get unless you catch the ace to make the nut low.
There's also the concept too that sometimes I continue to struggle with, and it's almost like a huge dissertation. I asked Adam Schwartz about it too, and it's blind defense on 08 with multiple callers to a raise when you're getting something like 6 or 7 to 1. I like to think I can play halfway decently pre-flop, and I find that I'm almost calling with any two wheel cards, even if it's not an ace, connected high cards. But I wonder if that's a little bit of a leak in my game. When you're getting 6, 7 to 1 in the big blind, like how have you figured out what to play there in blind defense?
blind defense in Omaha is a very, very difficult thing to do well. It's easy to get carried away and start thinking that you have enough equity to defend your blind against so many players and such and such situations. What's really important is that you learn to assess the value of your hand against your opponent's potential range. And if you think that your hand is going to play well, against your opponent's range, then it makes sense to defend. But a lot of times, you can get caught up with hands that you're going to end up getting trapped for bets, chasing something that's just the second best hand. So it makes a lot of sense to defend in your blinds in Omaha when you have something that can flop a very strong high hand, or of course if it can flop a very strong low hand. But if you're going to get caught up playing stuff like 3-4,
right.
XX, at a position against people who raise pre-flop, all that's going to end up happening is you're going to just chase lows that are just no good. So you have to make sure that your hand is going to flop very well against what your opponent is likely to be holding.
And then also if you're defending liberally in the big blind, I almost think that you might need to be comfortable with yourself as a player, knowing when to continue on, right, with the hand.
Oh, of course. If you're not going to play the hand correctly after the flop, then you probably should just play a tighter style in general. But if you want to talk about, if you want to kid yourself into thinking that you can play every hand perfectly after the flop,
right,
then of course you have to. A lot of people make very marginal calls. You see some of the greatest players in the world really defend their blinds loosely in Omaha.
There's also the concept too of when to open raise and when to open limp. It seems like in Hold'em nowadays, especially when you get to the higher levels, no one's really open limping that much, especially in a tournament when it's almost, I think it's almost never correct towards the later stages to open limp. But in Omaha, let's give an example, again, for people that don't necessarily know 08 that well. Let's say you've got like a ace, king, 4, 10 type hand where there's high and somewhat of a garbagey low with maybe a suited king. I like to sometimes think of, put the equivalent that's maybe like an ace 10 off and hold them from up front, where with that type of hand I have to open raise or fold as opposed to open limp. And take an example between that and like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 where you might open limp. What is your feeling on that?
Well, I think that it's fundamentally incorrect to be open limping generally in Omaha.
Okay.
I can see somebody making an argument for open limping under the gun, but I do realize that a lot of people love to open limp in early positions in Omaha and sometimes even middle positions. And my thoughts on that are that a lot of people are still playing Omaha incorrectly. And so if by you open limping it entices other players to play hands that they shouldn't be playing, then that'll generate you a larger edge. But when you're playing in a very competitive game, I think you're passing up on quite a large edge by open limping, because you really need to punish the big blind to not allow him to see a free flop. And people in late positions aren't going to be limping in with hands that they shouldn't be limping in with. They're going to be limping in with correct hands, knowing that they're getting a discount to see a flop. So I think that it's in the most competitive forms of Omaha, you really have to be open raising.
So even with like the smoothest of lows, like ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4, you're still going to open there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why open limp and let anybody have, why define your range against somebody from your position? I think it makes more sense to just put pressure on the blinds, and I think it's a similar concept that applies to all other forms of poker. I know that a lot of people seem to disagree with me that open raising is wrong in Omaha, because there still are a lot of people who love to open limp. But like I said, again, I really think that they've come to appreciate open limping because it turned out to be a very good counter strategy against the opposition they're facing, because their opposition just isn't playing correctly against their open limps. But like I said, against the most competitive players in the world, I think open limping is passing up on an edge.
Let's talk about the playability of high-only hands in a sense of, when someone's first starting 08, there's several types of point systems out there. I actually learned, I don't know if you're familiar with this thing called Hutchinson point system. This is when I first started out.
Sorry, I'm not familiar.
It just kind of gave like a range, for the lower limits. But one thing that it said in a lot of point systems is that usually hands 4 cards above 9 are playable. What do you think about the strict high hands in terms of when you play them in position? If you've got like an ace, king, queen 10 from up front without a suited ace versus that type of hand from out back. Let's specifically talk about a high-only hand from up front.
Well, like I said, I don't have pre-flop play understood perfectly in Omaha, not by a long shot, and I would say that goes to be about the same for just about everybody out there. But high hands have a lot of potential in Omaha 8 or better, and I also think it's very important to play them to make your range wider in other situations, and that does seem to be the case for a lot of players. A lot of players aren't playing enough high hands as they should, And it seems that people are playing tighter in Omaha than they should be. You should be stealing on the button aggressively. And a lot of people are waiting for, ace deuce 3, ace deuce 4 combinations. And you have to play more aggressive than that.
Now, what about when it's, when you come around, say, to a situation where you're going to 3-bet a pre-flop raiser versus a flat call? And obviously, again, I don't like to overgeneralize, but I find myself 3-betting with a hand that kind of works as maybe an ace king, maybe another Broadway low, as opposed to where I'm finding myself maybe smooth calling with like a suited ace deuce 5-6 type of hand. And I'm not necessarily right. This just seems to be my style, where I don't mind the blinds coming in when I've got that kind of smooth low from late position with suited cards. How do you kind of feel about that?
Well, I think a lot of players like to cold call with their ace deuces in Omaha because they go by the mentality that they want to draw a multi-way pot since they're drawing to the nut low. That makes perfect sense, but I think that the first thing you have to realize is they're playing an exploitable strategy just to take advantage of everyone else playing too loosely based on their cold call. So if you're playing in a game with weak opposition and you want to cold call, with your ace deuce really strong low draw hands, because people are going to be playing way too loose and they're going to be chasing you down with deuce 3s and stuff, then of course why drive them out when they're going to chase you down with deuce 3? But in a competitive game, I think that it's much more fundamentally correct to be 3-betting, even with your low hands. And why define your range so closely? If all you're going to end up doing is 3-betting your high hand potentials and flat calling when you have just a really nice 4-card low, so another reason to cold call is when you have a big blind that isn't very good in their big blind defense. A lot of players will defend way too loosely in Omaha, and if that's the case, you can make a really good argument for just flat calling and allowing that player to make his incorrect big blind defense. But if the big blind is a very good player, then you don't want to give that guy a profitable opportunity to see the flop for 1 bet when he could when you can force him to have to pay 2 and he wouldn't see it otherwise. So like I said, I really think that 3-betting is the closer thing to correct.
Well, that was a rather in-depth conversation about 08, and probably going to be the most in-depth about these rotations because it's the game usually I most play. But moving on to stud high, and this is a game where I feel I'm a little bit lost in the sense that I'll avoid the rotations with stud high just because I haven't taken the time to really, really learn the game. How did you go about learning in stud high? And let's discuss kind of some of the fundamental mistakes that people make in that game.
Stud high is a very, very interesting game, and I'm actually really starting to appreciate it for what it is right now. I struggled with stud high for a very long time, and they had it on the East Coast. I played a lot of stud, and it was a game that I always struggled learning. And I've come to realize that playing stud high is all about deciding when someone is oftentimes stealing. Knowing how your hand plays against a steal range and what your opponent's potential range is. So obviously, when your opponent opens a high card and it looks like he's going to be stealing, you need to be 3-betting a wide range when you think that it's likely you'll play well against that hand. You can't just be waiting for pairs. And a lot of people will muck pairs when a high card open raises, but that's often not the correct move because you're just letting him take down the antes way too much. And in reality, he's just raising with any 2 cards. So what ends up happening is you have to proceed on 3rd Street and stud high with hands that are very, very difficult to play, because if you end up getting your money in against if a king opens and he really does have a pair of kings and you're 3-betting him without a pair, or you're 3-betting him with a marginal pair, you're going to be getting your money involved in the pot as an underdog on every street for the rest of the hand. And so a lot of people will fold they'll play too tightly on 3rd Street. And what you really have to be doing is you have to be proceeding aggressively on 3rd Street, but realizing when your opponent's board has developed so strongly that now he's so much of a favorite against your range that it no longer becomes correct to proceed with the hand. So it's very, very it's a very, very interesting game because you have to be very, very aware of how your range is playing against your opponents on every street, and whether or not the current size of the pot and the equity of your range against his is strong enough to get to 7th Street and show it down.
I'll give you an example. I felt lost in a stud high hand against Victor Ramden. Victor Ramden's obviously a very, very aggressive player, and we were playing 1,500 horse right around the money a couple days ago, and I had brought it in with a deuce, and it got folded around to him in a steal spot, and he raised with a 9. And I had 2 overcards to the 9. I had a king, jack, deuce, all offsuit. A case can be made there to 3-bet?
Of course a case can be made to 3-bet. You know that Victor's probably opening any 2 cards with his 9. King Jack does seem just to be a little too loose, but of course it really depends on the size of the antes. And obviously the more antes that are in the pot, the more loosely you're supposed to proceed on 3rd Street. And That is honestly a very difficult question to determine whether or not you should be proceeding with your king jack, but that just seems a little bit too loose.
Too loose. So you might even just muck the hand.
I might, but honestly, that's a really good question. That's a really thin line right there. I would say.
Tough spot, and that's like I said, where I felt totally lost. The other thing about stud too, I find that stud 8 or better is a little bit easier for me because I don't have to remember the door cards as well. It almost seems that on 3rd Street and stud 8 or better, I can look at what is dead, and I'm disciplined enough to maybe fold like 8, 7, 4 with some 5s and some 6s dead out there. But in stud high, it seems like you have to remember so many door cards that it seems to intimidate me a little bit more. Do you have any tips in terms of how to go about to remember some door cards?
Well, the funny thing about it is I actually have a pretty bad memory.
Yeah.
I can't remember 10 minutes in the past. So memorizing all the dead cards in stud games is one of the challenging things that I have to deal with. One thing that I like to do is when I see all the dead cards, I like to order them in my brain numerically. So if I see an ace is dead, a 2 is dead, a 4 is dead, a 5 is dead, and another 5 is dead, I'll say to myself ace 2 4 5 5. And and I'll also try to keep a tab on what suits are currently dead. And so it seems like it's easier for me to memorize all the cards that are dead when I can sort them in numerical order in my mind.
One of the simplest things too, again for somebody that's first starting off, is maybe the overplayability of maybe 3 flush on 3rd Street. And what exactly are you looking for? Obviously, you're looking for your flush cards to be live, and then possible over cards against maybe a guy that brings it in with a high card.
So you're talking about stud high specifically?
Stud high, yeah, specifically stud high.
Of course, the more that there are dead cards of your suit, the less likely it is for you to be playing the hand. Mm-hmm. It's very dangerous to be getting involved with 3 flush hands that are rag hands. It's very, very important to have overcards to your opponent's board because it increases your equity substantially. And you really need that to be proceeding because you oftentimes don't have enough equity to proceed with a 3 flush hand that's a rag hand against the guy who's open raising, especially when that guy is open raising a hand that just tends not to be stealing. Like, for instance, if a guy opens a particular card into a bunch of high cards, that guy should really be starting with a pair.
Right.
It's one thing if a guy open raises a king into a bunch of lower cards, with 3 players stacked behind him, you can 3-bet him with your flush draw. But when a guy opens, a queen into an ace and 2 kings and a jack, that guy often really is starting with a legitimate pair. And you have to be very careful about proceeding with dangerous flush draw type of hands.
And also the playability of straights. I've seen a lot of kind of guys that I go scratching my head, guys that I don't consider really good players, getting involved with kind of middle-ish straights, which might be all low cards, to a guy that brings in like an 8, 9, 10-ish type of hand. When are those hands playable?
Well, when
can you get trapped in those hands?
When a guy open raises with a high card in a steal situation, you basically kind of have to 3-bet most of your 3-card straight draws. Mm-hmm. It's unfortunately your equity against a legitimate hand is not in good shape, but it's one of those spots where you kind of have to turn your hand into a potential resteal. And there are so many cards that you can improve on in 4th Street, that you can really turn into a strong drawing hand, if you proceed. So when your opponent open raises a high card and you decide to 3-bet with a 3-card straight, you of course you have to proceed carefully after the hand, and if you catch bricks on 4th and 5th Street, it's often correct to just get rid of it, and that's the real key to stud high. You have to there's a fine balance between knowing when and where to dump it. You constantly see players call 4th Street and then dump it on 5th, or call 5th Street, dump it on 6th. It really depends on how your opponent's board develops, and if it became clear to you that your opponent is actually involved in the hand with a strong hand, and you're sitting there 3-betting with your 3-card straight, but you caught a deuce on 4th Street, you probably should just muck 4th Street. Now,
the interesting thing, too, is that I've heard in stud high, specifically in stud high, that unless something very wacky happens on 6, if you call 5th, then you're almost always supposed to call 6th.
Yeah, that's basically the truth. Of course, if your opponent catches so good on 6th Street that the equity of his range against yours is so strong now that the math indicates that you should fold. Of course, it's when a fold is necessary. But generally, when you're chasing a 2-pair hand on 5th Street, it now becomes correct to chase your 2-pair on 6th Street. Unless, of course, like I said, your opponent caught a card that makes it pretty apparent that your 2-pair is not even going to be good if you do catch it.
Right. Like open trips or something like that.
Or if you caught like
a 4-flush.
Or if his board is so high to yours that it looks like he might, even have 2-pair, or, he might have a straight or something.
Right.
Like, a lot of those situations do arise. But it generally is pretty uncommon to call 5th Street and muck 6th Street.
We're talking to Joe Tall. He guest hosted here a few weeks ago, and he said something about how in stud high it's almost always correct to raise with the best draw. So if you are, say, confident that a guy's got 2 low pair, but you have aces early on in the hand, you have a draw to aces up. So when do you make that raise in a cash game, and when don't you make that raise in a stud tournament where the chips maybe are a little bit more valuable?
Well, there's a lot to be said for reducing your variance in a tournament setting. Especially when there's pay increases and there's bubble things to be considered. A lot of players were playing low variance styles at the final table where they were trying to keep their pot small. There are so many situations in poker where, under normal cash game circumstances, it's correct to push a very, very small edge, like 3-betting on 3rd Street, or betting when you have slightly more than 50% equity on 5th Street, and you'll see people push those small edges time and time again, because when poker becomes so competitive, you really just can't pass up on any edge and reduce your variance. But of course, when you reach like the bubble aspect of a tournament, it starts to make a lot more sense to why invest an entire big bet when you're only putting money in as a 53% favorite. It makes more sense to lay back and conserve those chips. So I was seeing a lot of players play a lot more. They were flat calling a lot more on 4th Street. I'm sorry. They're flat calling a lot more on 3rd Street in stud, at all the stud games, and they were open limping a little bit more in the flop games, and that makes sense for a final table and bubble situations.
One of the other interesting things I read when I was doing a little bit of research on stud high a few months ago on the internet was something that said that for a good stud player, for a very good stud player, stud could have half the variance of hold'em because of the extra big bet round and the advantage you have over weaker players. But for a bad stud player, it could have double or triple the variance of hold'em because of the extra big bet round. What do you think about that extra big bet round? Remember, there's 5 for all you out there. There are 5 betting rounds in stud with that extra big bet on 5th Street.
Well, actually, that's a really interesting point that nobody has ever presented to me. I've never really thought about the fact that there is an extra betting round in stud and how that affects your variance. I suppose that is a good argument. Perhaps your variance in stud is reduced because of the fact that there is an extra betting round. That's because there's an extra betting round. That's another street that you can capitalize on an edge. So, of course, the more edges you accumulate in a hand, the more likely it is that you won't run bet in the long run. But at the same time, adding an extra betting round to stud, of course, will make it a little bit higher variance because the pots are going to be bigger,
right,
since because of that. So, I think that most of the variance of games comes from, like triple draw, for instance. It's often correct to just chase your draw all the way down, and get to the river. Whereas in a lot of other forms of poker, like Razz, for instance, it's often correct to just get away from the hand immediately. If a pot hasn't been re-raised on 3rd Street and you brick and your opponent doesn't, you can fold for 1 bet. And so in stud high, it's easy to get away from a lot of hands early on streets. So for that reason, stud high seems to have like a decently low variance, but I don't know too much about that.
Well, that was a nice little discussion on stud high. Let's move on to Razz, since we just kind of segued into that. Now, Razz is interesting in the sense that when I was doing a lot of research on Razz, I realized that for people that are new to the Razz, the dead door cards are extremely, extremely important. Like, you want your cards to be dead. If I start off with 1, 2, 3, right, and I see like a couple of 3s and a couple of deuces out there, that's very, very good for my hand. But if I start off with 1, 2, 3, and there are 3 4s dead and 2 5s and a bunch of 6s dead, that's very bad for my hand, right?
Well, of course, it's important to not have dead. I mean, it's important to have dead cards so that you don't pair later on in the street. But I don't think it necessarily affects your starting hand values that much in Razz. To an extent, of course. But I don't necessarily know if that's the case. What's really important about dead cards in Razz is that on later streets, when your opponents catch certain cards, you really have to start to assess the probability that they paired. And of course, if you know that there's only 3 of a specific card left in the deck, and you're going to try to mathematically determine whether or not your opponent is paired, the math is completely altered whether or not he has 3 outs or 4 outs for that card.
Right. And it seems like that everyone thinks that Razz is definitely, the simplest game, but I just saw so many mistakes in some of these horse tournaments in the 3,000 and the 1,500 horse tournament. One of the things that I didn't quite understand is, when do you make a 3-bet on Third Street, and when is it kind of gambling? Like, if you have the best starting hand, 1, 2, 3, are you always supposed to make a 3-bet in a cash game, whereas in a tournament you wait and you see 4th Street to see how your equity increases?
Well, I would have to say that I really didn't pass up on any small edges in this entire 50K horse. The field is competitive enough that you can't just play a low variance style, from early on. I was playing a lower variance style when I started the final table, or at least I intended to, but I built the chips up really quick, so it wasn't necessary. But in general, if there's a small equity edge that you can build, and it increases your variance, you should just increase your variance and take it, because I think that games are so competitive that you really need to take advantage of every edge you can. And in Razz, you really need to 3-bet on Third Street as often as you possibly can, because it's right to open raise without a legitimate holding to steal the antes
right.
a large percentage of the time, and you really have to punish somebody for doing that. When I'm open raising in Third Street, in Razz as a steal, and I notice that people are flat calling behind me instead of 3-betting me as often as they should, it actually allows me to open raise even a larger range in general. So you can't allow a player to gain an edge by opening up a larger range than they normally would if you were to start 3-betting. So
I'll give you an example. A very aggressive player in Razz from a steal position opens with an ace, and you have an 8-up with, like, say, deuce 3, and you think that your hand range is so far ahead of what he could be doing, because he could basically be stealing with anything. You would maybe pop that there on Third Street?
I would almost always pop that. And the nice thing about having an 8-draw is that even if you are up against a better drawing hand, the equity edge that your opponent has on Third Street is very, very small. And in stud games, you should usually be 3-betting on Third Street in general, because even if your opponent does have a situation where he has 60% equity and you have 40, which is often a common scenario, like if your opponent has a bigger pair than you, he'll often have 60% equity and you'll have 40. By re-raising, you're getting your money in with 40% equity, and you're losing a little bit because of that, but it's often made up by the fact that you're punishing him for being in a steal situation. And on top of that, it's much more of a problem to encounter to be investing 40% equity on every single street for the rest of the hand than it is to be re-raising on Third Street, for 40% equity and only adding 10%, if you know what I'm saying.
Did you find that some of these guys in the 50,000, kind of the old grinder types that have been playing, Razz for many, many years, they were doing too much flat calling on Third Street?
Yes, I think that definitely people don't play aggressively enough on Third Street, and that was one of the areas where I thought I was accumulating an edge. As a lot of people would say, Razz does seem like a simple game, and in a lot of aspects it is. And I think the way that I like to explain it is that I believe that the mathematical problems that need to be solved in Razz are a lot easier than they are in a lot of other games. Just that there seems to be so many more in Razz. Like you're constantly faced with a mathematical problem, but it's oftentimes a lot easier to assess what the correct decision is, rather than in a game like Omaha or Hold'em, where you have to assess your range against your opponent's range, and trying to figure out the mathematical equity of that is very, very difficult. Whereas in Razz, it's like, okay, well, I have this draw, and my opponent is representing this draw. What's my equity? So it's much easier to assess a range.
And where does the balance come in? I'm thinking of specifically another hand that I got involved in the 1500, where I raised with ace deuce with a 7-up on the door, and a guy re-raised me with a 5. And I caught perfect right away. I caught a 3 perfect, but his board continued to get scarier. His board continued to get lower. I think he caught a 6, so it was a 5 and a 6 for him. I caught a 3. I then caught perfect 4 on 5th Street, so I had a 74 right away. Now he caught a 3, and he led again on 5th Street. Now I understand that I probably have the best hand there most of the time, because there's a chance that he pairs up. But if I do raise, do I get a guy who's paired up bluffing to stop shutting down, where he's betting, and if I raise, maybe he shuts down and maybe he dumps the hand? Or if his board just continues to get scarier, I let him continue to bluff and I just smooth call the whole way 74. He checked 7. Of course I value bet and he folded.
Well, that seemed like a good spot to go for a value raise on fifth, unless, of course, you really think that your opponent is not the type to bet there even if he had paired. So there aren't that many combinations that he can have for him to have made 6 at this point. You know, it's very hard to make a 6 in Razz. You know, it's very possible. If he was playing correctly, he's often going to have a 7 in his hand, or he's often going to have an 8 in his hand. You know, people should be 3-betting there with, 8 draws and stuff. So if that's the case, you can definitely value raise your 7 against him. Of course, the downside to that is basically you turn your hand face up because you're basically telling your opponent, I do have a made 7,
right.
And you don't really know where your opponent stands right now because there's a good chance that he's paired with catching two more low cards in his range. And there's also a good chance that he has a 7 in his hand, which means that you have a much smoother 7 than he does. But you need to be very careful when you turn your hand face up to your opponent.
Right.
There needs to be a very good equity edge that you can build if you're going to really turn your hand face up.
And I mean, with a perfect 7, they're obviously drawing to a wheel.
That seems like an equity that I would push.
Yeah, which of course I failed to do, but
that's okay.
Anyway, maybe a slight marginal thing. One of my favorite games, of course, in the horse rotation besides 08 is Stud 8 or Better. So let's move on to the E. Now, Stud 8 or Better, there's so many different things that come into play, and I want to talk about the playability of high hands, and specifically obvious high hands. I'm not talking about raising with a 4 with pocket kings in the hole, but raising, say, with split jacks. And when do you release? An old timer at the bike who used to play 20-40 stud high-low used to tell me, if you raise with a high hand and a guy calls with a low and then catches an ace, you should get out right away on fourth. Is that fundamentally correct?
Well, once again, it's all really about assessing your range against your opponent's range, and when your opponent catches an ace on 4th Street, it's almost always a clear time for you to be dumping your hand. Just the fact that he has a 4-card low and might have paired aces and now has 3 overcards to you, the pot is usually not big enough to justify proceeding. Of course, if it went multi-way and your opponent caught an ace and it got jammed on 3rd Street, now it's very possible that you have the odds to call down. So you have to be very, very careful when your opponent does catch an ace on whether it be 4th, 5th, 6th Street, whatever. It also depends on whether or not his board is progressing into a 3-card straight. All those things. Sometimes you just really have to know based on what your opponent is likely holding whether or not your jacks is strong enough to proceed.
And I think one of the other things that can be a really, really tough spot is when you don't make 2-pair on 5 when you're raising with a high hand, like say you raise with split jacks, and the guy makes maybe an open 3 cards to a low with like a gap straight in there. Like he calls with a 3, he catches a pretty good card, like he catches a 5, now he catches a 6, or maybe now he catches a 7, and now it's the big bet round. How do you proceed there? Again,
and you said that we don't have 2-pair?
We don't have 2-pair on 5. Yeah.
Basically, how it's supposed to work is if you open with a jack and let's say a low card either calls or 3 bets, whatever. I mean, well, I'm sorry, re-raises.
Right.
And then 4th Street comes and he catches another low card. The jack isn't supposed to be betting into him,
right.
Unless it's a situation where like his board is deuce 8 or something. Then you can justify betting into him because he's not drawing to any smooth high
right.
draws right now. But when he catches a coordinated card, you're definitely supposed to check to him because even if he has a 3-card low draw and a pair, he's in great shape against you.
Right.
So basically on 4th Street the standard play is to check call, and on 5th Street when he catches another baby, check folding is definitely an option here now that his board is so scary. But you of course aren't going to be betting into him
right.
with his strong board. And even if you did have 2-pair in this spot at this point, your opponent can't know that. So when you check to him on 5th Street, he's still going to be betting. So why bet out and tell your opponent that like I have 2-pair here?
Right.
Because he knows that you would have to be crazy to bet a pair of jacks into a 3-card low draw.
Right.
So and you'll see people time and time again define their hand based on how they play it when it's not necessary. Because even though you have 2-pair in 5th Street, if you check, your opponent's still going to bet his 3-card low, thinking that he's way ahead of you.
So I mean, the case obviously can be made. You can check fold there against a scary 3 low card when you've got a single pair. But what happens when we make jacks up now? Now, let's talk about multi-way versus heads up. But if we're heads up here, unless something crazy happens where he catches maybe open 4 cards to a low straight, are we kind of forced to just check call here with jacks up? Now that he's caught 3 low cards on 5.
When you see that your opponent has if he has 3 low cards on 5s and you have jacks
3
up.
low cards maybe to a gap straight. Now you've got jacks up. Yeah.
Well, like I said, I since he's going to bet his hand anyway, it's probably not a good idea for you to bet out and turn your hand face up and let your opponent know that you actually do have 2 pair.
Right, but I mean, are you forced now to check call pretty much the whole time when you make it?
Now that you made 2 pair, it becomes really, really hard to lay it down. You know, I mean, of course, there are some situations where you still have to lay down 2 pair. You know, when your opponent's board is so scary.
Right.
But generally, when you make 2 pair in stud 8 or better, you're often going to just get the showdown.
Get to showdown. Let's talk about bring-in defense as well in stud 8 or better. Say you've got a deuce up and you were the bring-in and a guy brings it in with like a small card in a steal position, and you have a banana being like a paint card, but you've got an ace underneath, like an ace, queen, deuce. I find myself sometimes struggling as to what I should do in that spot as well.
Well, proceeding definitely seems like the easy idea, but whether or not you're supposed to re-raise or just call there is a complicated question. And I think that what you have to consider when deciding whether or not to flat call here or re-raise is how you're balancing your strategy in general. And it's I think most people in the competitive games would balance their strategy by re-raising with an ace-king, deuce against a steal low card. Mm-hmm. Especially when the antes are so big, because it becomes much more justifiable for a low card to steal your to steal your bring-in with a banana as well. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're playing in a short-handed game and the antes are so much smaller, it becomes a lot less likely that they're stealing. So, of course, 3-betting becomes much more viable with large antes.
And let's talk about those hands that look pretty but actually become unplayable with what's out there dead in the door. I talked a little bit like 8-7-4, obviously not a great hand, but let's say you've got a 7-5-3 with maybe 2 or 3 4 dead, 2 or 3 4s dead, a 6 dead or a 3 dead, and it looks like someone's got a much, much better low draw than you. When you're talking about kind of 3 cards to a starting rough low with kind of gap straightening dead cards in the middle, I mean, are those hands that people kind of tend to overvalue and they just proceed with? Now it seems like I find like I'm looking out there at the door and I realize, what am I trying to make with this hand?
Well, you have to be very careful about why you're playing your 3-card low on 3rd Street. Mm-hmm. You can't just be raising Razz hands into a bunch of low cards. And what I mean by Razz hands is are hands that can improve to strong high hands. Like for instance, like an 8-6 deuce would be considered a Razz hand.
Right.
You have a low draw, but you have no shot to make a high hand.
Right.
And that's the same problem with a hand like 7-5-3 when you have a bunch of dead 4s or whatever. You're not going to be able to make straights. And so there's still a lot of reason to proceed with it. Keep in mind that stealing the antes is huge in stud 8 or better, in all the stud games. So whether or not you have to open this hand really depends on the likelihood that the opponents behind you are mathematically going to be able to start with a hand that's in much better shape than you. What I mean by that is if you're up against a bunch of lower cards, you can assess the probability that they're actually starting with a strong 3-card low, and whether or not you're going to be put in a bad situation on further streets, and whether or not you should be opening this hand.
Now, the ace, obviously, in 8 or better is the power card, especially in the door, right? You got a power card. But I saw some guys basically just auto complete with an ace, no matter what was out there. And I guess my question is, at what point, when you're in a steal spot, do your pocket cards matter? In the sense, like, if you've got like an ace 9-10 versus like an ace queen deuce, one playable for a steal versus another one that's not playable for a steal?
Well, the ace queen deuce is a far better hand than ace 9-10, of course. And like I said, it really depends on what you think the probability is that your opponents are going to proceed that are behind you. The more low cards that are behind you, the harder it is for you to open raise, with junk, in the hole. And that is a common thing that I see with a lot of players. A lot of players will open an ace and they don't care what's behind them, and that's wrong. And I actually was over aggressive with ace up cards and studied it better in the past. I would open them too aggressively, and I've come to learn better now. You have to be very selective and know whether or not the pot is big enough for you to proceed with this steal, against the likely scenario that someone's going to be 3-betting you behind you, since they all, they're slow cards left to act.
And at the same token, do you see that people, just like we talked about at Razz, do you see that people were cold calling far too much against a guy who might be stealing with an ace. With what is maybe a semi-premium low hand, like say like a deuce 3-6, if you saw a guy who you thought was a high probability of stealing with an ace, would you 3-bet there on 3rd Street with like a deuce 3-6?
And you're talking about stud 8 or better?
Yeah, stud 8 or better, yeah.
Absolutely. If I think that the guy might have a really bad equity edge against me, then it makes sense for me to re-raise him on 3rd Street. Like I said, you really have to punish people for stealing antes, because if you don't, they are justified in stealing with even a wider range. So that's just I think that's just good poker to play aggressively on 3rd Street in general. When it becomes obvious that your opponent isn't stealing, like he opened up a low card into so many low cards, or he opened up an ace into so many low cards that you know that your opponent has started with a legitimate hand,
right,
then it becomes a lot less of an incentive for you to want to re-raise, because you know that your opponent has a legit hand. So you're not punishing him for potentially being on a steal.
And at that same token, let's say like a guy opened a king with an ace to his left. I mean, don't you almost always have to give him credit? Well, I want to ask you what you think about people opening with high cards with aces to your left, but let's say a guy does that. You almost always have to give him credit for usually split kings there in that spot, right?
That's a mistake that a lot of people seem to make too much. They open pair of kings into ace high cards more than they should.
Yeah.
And I mean, when a guy opens a king into an ace, he really should be having a pair of kings there.
Right.
Know,
you're saying they're making a mistake opening without a pair of kings into an ace?
No, I'm saying people make the mistake too often of opening a pair of kings into
right.
into bad cards
right.
behind them.
Yeah.
And when a guy opens a king into an ace, you should expect him to at least have a pair of kings. But some people will start there with ace deuce king, 3 clubs, and that could be justifiable based on the situations and the circumstances.
Now, what if you do have the highest split pair out there with an ace and a couple low cards to your left? The playability of, say, split kings, maybe 2nd or 3rd to act with an ace out there, and then maybe with a 4 and another low card behind there. Is that playable? When is it playable? Do you ever dump the hand in that spot with the ace to the left? I mean, it is stud 8 or better. I'm a little lost sometimes in that spot.
That's a really dangerous spot to be proceeding.
Yeah. Would you limp in, or would you just sometimes fold?
You can make a case for limping in with a pair of kings if you think that the player with the ace is passive enough to not pounce on your weakness. If you see a person limp with a pair of kings and you have an ace showing, a lot of people will just raise there with any cards on the hole, hoping that you'll just muck your pair of kings on 3rd, and a lot of people will limp call with a pair of kings, hoping that's the case. Basically, if you're going to limp in with a pair of kings, you really have to hope that your opponent isn't going to raise you aggressively, and you probably are justified in mucking for the completion on 3rd if that's the case. If he does raise. 45
minutes of horse. That was great. I got to tell you, we covered a lot of topics. Let's move on to the draw games here for a second. Deuce to 7. Where did you learn how to play that game? I know Negreanu wrote kind of pretty interesting stuff in Super System 2. Have you read that?
Yeah, that was where I got my start learning how to play triple draw. I used to be completely clueless on how to play the game, and reading Negreanu's chapter was definitely the start that I needed to learn it. It's very informative. I began playing against my friends, practicing it, and I started playing triple draw in rotations where I had such a large edge in the other games that even though I wasn't a good triple draw player, I thought that I could still find an edge in the game overall. So I was playing in mixes where I was a losing triple draw player, but I was winner in the other games, and so it offset it into a little a profit margin. But now I'm starting to really feel comfortable with my triple draw game, and it just took me experience and really thinking through the math of the game and what decisions are correct and what decisions aren't. I actually talked to Negreanu because I think he's going to be on the show here in a couple weeks, and I told him I want to talk about triple draw, and he's like, well, really? Because it's a very technical game. Oh, of course.
You're basically saying, what is the general concept for someone that doesn't play triple draw? Is it drawing to the best hand, starting out with the best draw?
It's about knowing what to draw to against what your opponent is currently drawing to, and you just have to be able to know whether or not it's better to draw to a 4-card this versus a 3-card that. Whether or not your equity is higher in which regards, and learning how to draw correctly in triple draw is something that's difficult to learn, but once you learn how to do it, it becomes a lot easier to play the game well. I'm trying to think of an example. Here, you're going to help me out here. Drawing 2 to a 7 versus 1 to an 87. Yeah, there you go. Drawing 2 to 7 versus 1 to an 87. That's a long debate that a lot of people have, and it really depends on the situation. In shorthanded play, I can't really come up with too many situations where it makes sense to me to muck an 87 draw, unless of course the guy stood pat right off the bat. But generally, having that having a 4-card draw versus a 3-card draw is just huge in triple draw. So I generally keep my 87s, and I don't draw for the 7s in general. But of course, when I've come to realize that my opponent has made something that beats an 87,
right,
you got to break your 8 or draw smooth.
You think he's made like an 8-5? I guess that's what an example is. Like, you think the guy's made a better 8, you might have an 8-7, and you draw 2 to a 7, right?
Right.
In a spot like that. Padugi. And this is going to be the last game we're going to talk about. For those of us that don't know what that game is, triple draw, a triple draw game with 4 cards, and the goal is to draw to 1, 2, 3, 4 all offsuit, right? And I have never seen any literature on this game at all. And has the math been figured out? Are you just going about it on your own, trying to figure out the best way to play in it?
There aren't that many utilities to try to learn the math in Padugi, and that's what's really challenging about it. It seems to be the same case with triple draw. There's just not a whole lot of resources out there, so you kind of have to do it on your own. And some of the math I don't fully understand. Like, I actually haven't seen the numbers. I haven't done any simulations, but I've just come to learn from experience that one decision looks like it's much more mathematically beneficial than the other decision, and that kind of, I guess, it comes from learning from experience. Like, unfortunately, like I said, there's just not a whole lot of utility to actually learn the math. You kind of just have to learn it on your own and hope that you're right.
And the thing that I haven't played a ton of Padugi, but the thing that what I try to do, especially from up front, is draw smooth, maybe draw 3 to a wheel, 1 card to a wheel, whereas you see guys drawing any 1 card to a 10. Stuff like that.
Game.
Yeah. But I mean, from up front, what say, give an example of a playable hand, maybe from the first few spots, or what you have found that you think that is marginally profitable.
In a full ring Padugi game,
yeah,
under the gun, you really need to be opening 3 cards, 6s in general, and pat hands, of course. Of course, depending on how the game is, you can really open up your range in general. If you want to open up your range because people are playing their 3-card 10s, then open raise an 8. A 3-card 8. That makes sense. But of course, you got to be careful deviating from what you believe to be correct strategy, because if you're wrong, you're going to end up being a losing player.
But it seems like it's a big time gambling game, right? It seems like guys are playing. I mean, it almost seems like they're just gambling, like with no real regard for the math at all, at least from my experience limited playing it.
The competition in Padugi is definitely lacking in comparison to the other games. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some Padugi expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm still trying to learn the game, myself. I'm starting to finally pick it up really well. But everyone has a long way to go in terms of improving. There hasn't just been much literature out there about it, and there hasn't been much. I mean, of course, there's no games on the internet, so people just don't have that much of an opportunity to actually improve.
Now, one of the most common mixes that you see in California is the BOT, Padugi, Omaha, and Triple Draw. And again, that's a big-time gambling game in Padugi. Triple Draw, obviously skill, but it's still a little more gambling in the sense of that it's a triple draw game. And then the Omaha, do you find that the Omaha round is the most exploitable when you're playing in that mix?
Well, like you said yourself, I think people are still learning Padugi, so if you can be the first person to play Padugi better than everyone else, then that seems like the most exploitable game to me. As people start to learn Omaha and Triple Draw, as well as they are, they're starting to play the games closer to perfect than they ever have in the past. You need to really figure out where to gain an edge, and if that means that you really need to develop your Padugi game levels ahead of everyone else, that's where your edge is going to shine.
Well, Mike, I want to appreciate you, or I appreciate you coming on the show, going over 7 games there in about 50 minutes. I think we covered a lot. Congratulations again on your second place finish, and we can look for you on ESPN.
Well, thanks a lot, Bart.
All right.
Appreciate you having me.
Thanks a lot. And we will see you next week. Thank you for joining us right here on Cash Plays.